Welcome to The Word Revealed with David Palmer and Scott Burns, where we talk about everything Bible from Genesis to Revelation. Let's join the conversation.
Welcome back to The Word Revealed. I'm David Palmer with my good friend, fellow lover of Christ and His Word, Scott Burns. How are you doing, Scott?
David, I'm doing better than I deserve.
Praise the Lord. I love hearing you say that.
It's true.
What do you want to talk about today?
Well, last week we were talking about non-biblical writers or historians. We talked about Roman writers, Suetonius, Tacitus, Pliny. There's a guy who comes up over and over when you start reading biblical commentaries, books about the Bible. I came across him yesterday, opened up Peter Walker's In the Steps of Jesus to look up. I was looking for some cultural information, and almost the exact page I opened to was a paragraph about Josephus's description of Lake Galilee. Josephus is somebody that, if you start reading biblical commentaries and books about Jesus, you're gonna encounter this guy. Who on earth is Josephus?
Josephus is really an important first century figure. You know, in my own life of study, I think I've spent more time with Josephus intellectually than any other person outside of the New Testament directly.
So you know this guy a little bit.
Well, I do feel like I know this guy at one level, but I've just spent a lot of time with his works, and his works are large. He wrote 30 volumes, and he's a first century writer. He is probably born around AD 37, so just a few years after the death and resurrection of Jesus. He lives through the first century, dies probably around 100. So he is a contemporary of the New Testament environment. His name, we call him Josephus. So his name at birth actually is Yosef ben Matityahu. Is his Hebrew name. He's a Jewish man. His name is Yosef, so Joseph. He's the son of Matityahu, and so this is similar to the name Matthew that Yahweh has given. He's from a priestly family, and one of the 30 volumes that he writes is his biography, his sort of autobiography called The Life. And he shares in that he's from a priestly clan. He is actually he takes pride in the fact that he's from the first named family division of priests in Chronicles, and so he's of priestly descent. He's an aristocratic guy. He is someone who loves his country. He loves his faith of Judaism, and he lives during this really tumultuous period. Just a quick sketch, very quick sketch. Like he tells us that he grows up during this time. He tells us that at one point he explored being a Pharisee. He at one point is sent on a delegation to Rome to try to free some priests who'd been imprisoned there. So something sort of like Paul's experience of being imprisoned. He goes to try to release them, secure their release. But his life ends up intersecting in a really dramatic way with the war that happened. So when he's 29 years old, he is put in charge of the Jewish forces in Galilee, and he is there, puts up a valiant defense of a city called Jotapata, which is right near Cana of Galilee, and the city falls to the Roman forces, and he's taken into custody by the Roman general Vespasian. And as he goes into that, he says to Vespasian that Vespasian's going to be emperor someday, which is shocking to Vespasian because Nero's on the throne. And usually you don't say you're going to be the emperor if there's another emperor.
Seems like a bad idea.
It does, but Vespasian, we have to remember that the Romans were very superstitious, and Vespasian was startled. Josephus says, you and your son. The events of the war play out. Nero commits suicide. There's, in the middle of the Jewish war with Rome, this is the most tumultuous year in Roman history. 4 different emperors compete for the throne. and Vespasian does end up as the emperor, and his son Titus completes the siege of Jerusalem, and so Josephus is remembered, and he is basically adopted into the Flavian family and given patronage. So that's why his name, Joseph, gets the Latin ending. Josephus is the Latin nominative ending. And he's sometimes called Flavius Josephus because that's the family name of the Roman emperor, new imperial family. Nero's the last of the Julio-Claudian emperors, and then there's a new imperial dynasty, which ends up being Vespasian, Titus, and Domitian, the emperor at the time of the book of Revelation. And Josephus spends the last part of his life in Rome with the patronage of the Flavian emperors. And what does he do with those years? He writes. And he writes these large works. So there's the Jewish War, 7 volumes, and then his big work, which is going to be important for us today in particular, is what's called the Jewish Antiquities. So it's a 20-volume work that's based on, that's a massive work, retelling of the Bible, basically for the first 16 volumes, and then volumes 17 to 20 give us first century history. And we have nothing like it. So
okay.
That's a long answer.
That's okay.
It's an important guy.
Yeah, so he is running around at the same time as like the early church guys.
He is, yeah.
And when the New Testament is being written,
right,
and dispersed, he is also running around and beginning to write.
He is. So, and that's an important point because his works, he tells us that the Jewish War was originally published in Aramaic and then translated into Greek. That his works, which are the Antiquities, 20 volumes, Jewish War, 7 volumes, an apologetic work called Against Appian, which is 2 volumes, and then his Life, which is 1 volume. All of his works are transmitted by the church, by Christians. And that's actually going to be really important for this story because the works are not preserved in Judaism. They're preserved by the church. And even the work, when I teach apologetics, the first work I want people to know is his Against Appian, because the church fathers, they saw, wow, here's a guy who's making all of these great apologetic arguments towards the pagan world for biblical faith, and early Christian writers quote him extensively for that. But
so is he a Christian?
There's not indication that he ever became a Christian, and so there's some pathos to that story. He's an eyewitness to early Christian history, though, and describes the first century from a Jewish perspective that we don't have from anyone else. So, like your book, you mentioned Peter Walker's description of Galilee. So the Jewish War, which is his account of the war, and it's interesting, the Romans called it a revolt, but the Judeans called it a war. So the use of terms matters.
Yeah.
But part of the Jewish War is Josephus wanting to tell the story in a way that honors, like, no, we fought valiantly, we have a noble history. There were accounts of the war that were very, pro-Roman. Of course, the new Flavian dynasty is built on the military success of devastating Jerusalem. So there's a real spike in slander, and his work is sort of saying, I want to correct this. But he also knows that his readership probably has never been to Israel, doesn't understand the customs of Jews and Judeans, doesn't know the geography, which is kind of the position that most Christians are in when they start reading the New Testament.
Yeah.
So that's why it's like, this is fantastic. So he gives this detailed description of Galilee in the first century. He gives our most detailed description of the Essenes, or the Pharisees, the Sadducees. What did they believe? He tells us a lot about New Testament persons like Herod the Great or Pontius Pilate. And for our podcast, he also mentions Jesus twice. So
okay, let's dig into that.
Okay. So he actually mentions John the Baptist. He mentions James and the brother of Jesus, and he mentions Jesus twice. So maybe we talk about those in that order just briefly.
Okay.
So John the Baptist, this is in Antiquities, book 18, so it's pretty deep into the work. And Josephus mentions the story of John the Baptist, and he highlights that John was put to death by Herod Antipas, and because of John's prophetic critique of his unlawful marriage, and Herod has John killed, and Josephus is the one who tells us that he took him to Machaerus, the fortress near the Dead Sea. And fascinatingly, Josephus tells us that Herod was defeated in a military battle after this. And Josephus says that this was because God was punishing Herod because of his unjust execution of John the Baptist. So he gives a description of John's ministry, of his emphasis on baptism with water, purification of the body, and so it's a description of John's ministry that is analogous to what we read in the Gospels.
Yeah.
But I find the most fascinating thing is Josephus sees John as a righteous man, and he sees that God punishes Herod because of what he did to John. So that's his description of John the Baptist.
So John the Baptist mentioned all four Gospels, and now Josephus, non-biblical writer, also mentioning John the Baptist.
Right.
Gives us pretty good confidence that John the Baptist was a real dude.
Yeah. If someone says to you, I'm not sure if John the Baptist ever existed, then you can just say, well, in my humble but accurate opinion, you don't know what you're talking about, right? So, I mean, there's just multiple, the people, you can say anything, but, we're bound, as Christians, we are bound to a faith that's rooted in reality.
Yeah.
I mean, Paul says if this didn't happen, people should feel sorry for us because we've based our whole life and risked our eternity on a lie. So it does matter.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the short mention of Jesus is in book 20 of Antiquities. So it's in the last book, and he's telling the story up until he's narrating events late into the first century. Remember when Paul is imprisoned in Caesarea, he appears before a couple of these Roman governors, and he appears first before Felix, and then Felix leaves office and Festus is there. Then he appeals to Nero. In book 20, Festus dies in office, and there's a new Roman governor who's en route, and his name is Albinus, according to Josephus, and which could be a nickname. Most of these guys' names, are nicknames, like Felix. People name their cats Felix. Yeah. Because Felix just means happy in Latin. So, Albinus, white, could mean just really fair-skinned guy. So it's this interval that the new governor has yet to arrive. And in that moment when there's no Roman governor on site, the priest Ananus moves against James, the leader of the church. So this is James, the brother of Jesus from the Gospels, who ends up as the leader of the church in Jerusalem. And Ananus moves against him, and Josephus introduces him and just mentions him in this way. He says that Ananus assembled the Sanhedrin and brought before them the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, whose name was James. They form an accusation as breakers of the law and deliver them to be stoned. this event historically does lead to James's death. And remember, stoning is a religious mode of execution in Judaism. It's not a Roman way of killing someone. But the key point for us is he just says James was a brother of Jesus who was called Christ.
Yeah.
So that doesn't mean, and this is important, it doesn't mean that Josephus all of a sudden has become a Christian. He's just reporting that this Jesus is differentiated by the fact that he has this nickname. The name Jesus is the Hebrew Joshua. There are 24 guys named Joshua in antiquities. So there are a lot of Joshuas.
Yeah.
There are a lot of Jesuses. And so he just highlights this one was called Christ.
But that's a significant nickname.
So it's why do you say that?
Because
I'm putting you on the spot.
Because it's who Jesus is, the Messiah. It's who he came to be.
So you think that when you hear the word Christ, like I can see it in your face now, like bells go off, right?
Yeah.
When I hear that word, I'm a Christian. It's like, yes, right? When I'm talking with someone and they're like, Jesus is the Christ, we're like, let's schedule the baptism, right? I mean, but we have to remember that for who's reading antiquities, and the word Christ in Greek means anointed one, but for you and for me and for other people of faith, we've been taught correctly that Christos in Greek is the Greek form of Mashiach, the anointed one, but we know that there's an expectation for a coming anointed one, a Messiah, a Savior, so to recognize Jesus as that carries with it a whole train of theological meaning. But if you've never heard that before, and you just are told, well, this guy's nickname is Felix, happy, this guy's nickname is white, fair-skinned, and this guy's nickname is anointed. It doesn't, I think it's important to notice that Josephus doesn't explain that. In the Gospels, when John introduces this word, he is Christ, or he is Messiah, that is translated as Christ. The Gospel writers actually help you because they envision an audience they're trying to persuade that Jesus is the Christ, but they also recognize that a number of people in their audience don't even know what that would mean. So Josephus doesn't explain it. He just reports it. So this is the first one. But nevertheless, it's clear evidence of Jesus.
Yeah, outside of the Bible.
Outside of the Bible. So we have these Roman writers, which we've talked about. We have Josephus as a Jewish writer, and the early Christian writers. The first one to mention Josephus is in this regard, with referencing of Jesus, is Eusebius in his church history. But he quotes the famous passage. So, you ready for that?
Yeah.
Okay. So, the most famous passage, and it is controversial on a few different axes, and maybe we need a whole episode to talk about it. But the most famous passage is in Antiquities, Book 18, and it's in paragraph 63 or verse 63 and 64. So maybe I just read it for those unfamiliar. This is it's important to point out that Josephus is describing in this section of Book 18, he's describing a set of incidents that took place during the governorship of Pontius Pilate. So even on that count, Josephus is just reporting a set of 4 different things that happened, and they weren't good things. They were, he was painting a picture of corruption and violence from Pilate toward the Judeans, of simmering tensions, in the land on the other direction. So in the midst of all of that, I think this is the third of the incidents, but it's in a set of incidents. And then he just says, now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man, for he was a doer of literally he says, of paradoxical deeds. He was a teacher of such men as received the truth with pleasure. He won over many Judeans or many Jews and many of the, literally says, of the Greek element in society. He was the Christ, and when Pilate, at the prompting or the instigation of the leading men among us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at the first did not forsake him. He appeared to them alive again the third day, as the divine prophets foretold these and myriads or thousands of other wondrous things about him. And even up until now, the tribe of the Christians, so named for him, have not gone away or have not become extinct. That's what he says.
That's powerful.
It is. So you tell me what you unpack that. It is powerful.
Well, this Jewish historian, speaking of Jesus and Pilate and Christians who are continuing to exist.
Right.
I mean, that's outside of the Bible.
And it's evidence, remember, that Josephus is publishing this work like in the mid-90s. So we have to, he's talking about events that happened 60 years ago.
Yeah.
And so they're already a pretty significant distance away from him by the time he's writing. And he says Christians are still around.
And Jesus had done wonderful works, paradoxical works.
Yeah.
Drew over Jews and Gentiles, condemned to a cross by Pilate.
Exactly.
Appeared alive again on the third day. I mean, this is...
Sounds pretty good, doesn't
Yeah.
it? And that's the challenge. I think at a minimum, we'd have to say this is additional external evidence that Jesus exists. That really is something no one should say. You have a lot of first century authors who mention him. You have the locating the life of Jesus in time as condemned under Pontius Pilate. And that's actually the reason that Eusebius first quotes this passage. He quotes this passage in Josephus to make the point that Jesus died during the reign of Pontius Pilate. And that means that was during 26 to 36 AD. We have, like in the other writers, you have the statement that Jesus died, and died by crucifixion, which isn't a complimentary thing to say.
Right.
So you have the basics of the gospel testimony, but the passage is controversial because some people think this is like too good to be true. Some people have argued that this passage sounds like Josephus is a Christian, or sounds like too much. So I think we need an episode to just break this passage down. Maybe how do we understand what he's really saying here, line by line?
I'm intrigued. Let's do it.
Okay. Well, we're glad that you've joined us on The Word Revealed to get to know a little bit about Josephus, son of Mattathias, and his importance for the first century. But also, all of his works are readily available and in good translations, and it's a source that people should be familiar with. And so it's exciting to touch on evidence for Jesus outside of the New Testament, and we just warmly invite you to join us on the next episode as we look into this paragraph in more detail. So God bless you all, and thanks for joining us on The Word Revealed.
Yeah, good to be with everybody.
Thank you for joining Dr. David Palmer, Senior Pastor at Kenwood Baptist Church in Cincinnati, and Scott Burns, Associate Pastor. Meet us here next time for another conversation on the Bible.